Okay, so the numbers have stopped going out, so we'll make a start given that we are running slightly behind schedule, so apologies again for that. We've had a few minor technical difficulties. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alice Teague. I'm a Deputy Director in Welsh Government. I'm pleased to welcome you here to the final afternoon of the week-long Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference. The theme for this afternoon is the continuation of the one that's been across the last 2 days of benefits being shared equitably. We're going to kick off this afternoon with a workshop, firstly on innovative finance, and then followed by a message from Sir David Henshaw to close the conference. If you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat during the sessions, and we will pick up questions in particular if there's time for the presenters at the end of the sessions. Details of the presentations and the speakers' biographies can be found on the Hoover web page. And all of the sessions are being recorded and will be available afterwards through the WBP website. So if you want to go back and rewatch something, or if you think there are sessions that colleagues would benefit from watching, you can send these over to you. So delighted to introduce the first session this afternoon. I'm going to be handing over very shortly to Elizabeth Beale from Finance Earth to take us through a workshop on innovative finance. So Elizabeth co-leads Finance Earth's investment advisory work. She's a specialist in nature-based solutions and climate finance and has worked in an advisory capacity, providing insight on project design, feasibility and investment models across a range of sectors and geographies for more than 15 years. So those of you that aren't familiar with Finance Earth, they provide a range of finance advisory and fund management services across the natural and built environment. They work in partnership with project developers, government, businesses and enablers to create investable environmental and social projects. And at the same time, they also work with a range of investors to structure financial projects to accelerate the delivery of the right capital to the right activity. Finance Earth have been part of the Financing UK Nature Recovery Coalition, which was developed in the run-up to COP26 to demonstrate how to leverage large-scale private investment into nature in the UK. And they also provided advice to a range of organisations, including DEFRA, NatureScot and ENGOs. And currently Finance Earth are providing advice to Welsh Government on developing a sustainable delivery model for biodiversity and the feasibility of a public interest company for woodlands. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Elizabeth and I will hand over to you, Elizabeth, for your session.
Thanks very much, Alice. Delighted to be with everyone today. I'll just bring up the presentation so we can get started right away. And thank you for that introduction, Alice. By way of introduction to myself, thrilled to be here today and really thrilled to have the invitation to join you all and join this important discussion as part of the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference. Alice, you already gave a great overview of Finance Earth. Maybe just to say a few additional words. We were co-founded in 2016 with the idea that we really wanted to make finance work for nature instead of nature working for finance. And the team brings a wealth of experience in finance, which we deploy with our partners, which you can see depicted on this screen, which we're thrilled to include, many of the world's leading NGOs like WWF and RSPB, but also working closely with a range of government partners like the Welsh Government, Scottish Government, and with DEFRA on a range of these areas. And as Alice pointed out, with a range of investors on structuring investments that work not only to meet investors' criteria, but could deliver real impact in terms of environmental and social criteria on the ground. I'll leave it at that, but happy to answer any additional questions about Finance Earth if time allows at the end. So today in this session, we're going to be covering, the scope of the challenge and the priority for mobilizing private finance for nature recovery and biodiversity, how private finance can engage in financing nature recovery, what are some of the learnings that we can take from existing markets like carbon, and what are some of the emerging areas like nutrient neutrality and other lessons that we can derive from regulated markets like we've seen with BNG development in England in order to distill those for some key points on what it can take forward in terms of thinking about innovative financing for biodiversity in Wales. So I welcome questions. As Alice said, please post them in the chat. Happy to get to them at the end or address them in follow-up if time is short. So with that, to jump into the scale of the problem, I know you will have been discussing this all week, and many of you are very aware of the urgent attention that is needed to address the scale of biodiversity loss. 1 million species are at risk of extinction. 1/3 of the world's topsoil has been degraded. Climate change is exacerbating the impacts on important habitats from forests to coral reefs. And with more than half of the world's GDP moderately or highly dependent on nature and the services it provides, the loss of biodiversity is an urgent issue for us all to address. The estimates for the amount of funding needed to halt biodiversity loss globally are estimated at more than 800 billion per year. And currently, finance globally is about only 12 to 13% of that. So when we look at the UK, zooming in, the financing gap is around 44 to 97 billion. That's a wide range, but the numbers on either side are huge to achieve the UK's objectives of nature-related ambitions over the course of 2022 to 2030. When we zoom in further on Wales, that's 5 to 7 billion. So we're talking about a huge gap where public and philanthropic funding alone won't be enough. And there's an urgent need to look at innovative ways to bring in additional forms of capital, including private finance. So when we look at this gap broken down by area, so areas of nature recovery which need to be addressed, biodiversity is second in terms of where the gap is highest. And in Wales specifically, biodiversity is on par with reducing flood risk and improving bioresource efficiency, which refers to the reduction of pressure on terrestrial and marine environments. So thinking about sustainable fishing and improving soil health. These are areas where it's been more difficult to mobilize private capital in the past, as opposed to where you might see climate mitigation with less of a gap, because there has been further attention in recent years on that area. So what are some of the ways that we can mobilize private capital to finance nature recovery and specifically biodiversity? Before jumping into the meat of that, I do want to go through, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these and they've been coming up throughout the week, but just to cover off and not bog down anyone with jargon or terminology, to go through the concepts of payments for ecosystem services. So related to environmental economics, around the idea that nature is providing essential services like climate mitigation or natural flood management or biodiversity improvement, which all have an economic value but have not necessarily been captured or adequately captured in the past. So assigning a value to these services and creating a system whereby payments can be made for them is a key aspect of mobilizing private finance to protect and restore these services. And assigning a value for these services depends very much on developing metrics and definitions around what can be considered as a tradable unit, which can then be, was produced and then traded. This is where codes come in. So codes can establish rules, metrics around what defines a unit, and that provides credibility to actors who want to engage in this space, that the value being assigned is related to actual improvements on the ground. Most of us are familiar with the term of markets, obviously, but when we refer to environmental markets, this is where we're talking about the buyers and sellers of units associated with ecosystem services. The carbon market is one example that probably most are very familiar with. And markets can exist in a voluntary markets or regulated or compliance markets, where trading among participants can happen. Both include governance structures with rules and definitions for actors to engage, but there's important differences in terms of scope, targets, and enforcement. So, and it's also important to note that while some codes and markets have been established focused on a specific ecosystem service, like carbon, which I've referred to, there's often co-benefits achieved through the projects or the units being derived. Those co-benefits can relate to biodiversity or water, and they're not necessarily captured in the value of that unit. Similarly, where there are codes developed that are narrowly focused on a specific ecosystem service, again, we'll use carbon as the example, there can be trade-offs or negative impacts on other ecosystem services if those areas aren't fully considered. So we'll talk through some of that in the presentation today, but hopefully that provides some context for some of the issues that we're going to go through in more detail. So when we talk about payment for ecosystem services and what that means in terms of private finance, who's involved, what are they paying for, where is revenue generated, and who's buying it. So I'll zoom in on biodiversity here. The intervention, for example, would be habitat creation or restoration or species conservation, which could be carried out by a public or private entity like a farmer or an NGO. This intervention of restoration or habitat protection can generate units, again, based on a specific code or regulation which defines the conditions that need to be met to generate those units. These units then have a value associated with them, either determined through voluntary supply and demand or through regulation, such as a price floor or a carbon price as examples. The sellers of these units can then generate revenue by selling these units to a specific buyer. That buyer could be a corporate, for example, looking to illustrate that they're having a nature positive approach, or it could be through mandated legislation, for example, where property developers need to achieve a certain amount of biodiversity net gain in order to have future developments approved. So the generation of revenue through the sale of units is what can be then considered along other traditional forms of revenue like tourism or forestry or farm activities to raise investment against and excuse me, and to then fund those interventions which will result in the improvements in ecosystem services. So it's important to understand how this functions in that it's looking at revenue creation, which that then can attract repayable finance. So when we think about PS projects as well, there's a range of roles played by a range of actors. I referred to this a bit in the previous slide, but this is just to give you a depiction of where all those pieces come in. So as you can see, the role of the investor in providing capital for the improvement of ecosystem services goes towards the development of a project. To be credible, this often requires independent verification through standard bodies, those codes that I've referred to ensure that it meets rules set out or the accompanying regulation where it exists. PES buyers or brokers can then purchase these units, which can occur directly or through established registries. Established registries create more transparency in the system and allow for also looking at things at a more holistic or national level. There are a range of other important actors, though, to consider in this landscape in terms of convening agreement on what constitutes a credible unit. There's been a lot of attention around the fact that some carbon credits, for example, haven't actually delivered on the carbon reductions which were associated with them. There's been a lot of activity to then make standards and codes more robust and improve on those to ensure that they are actually delivering on the impact and that investors and buyers can be ensure that what they're paying for is actually achieving the impact that they want to. This credibility is really important for attracting repayable finance and creating greater certainty in these markets. So what if all of this exists, and as the structures I've walked to, why haven't we seen more private finance flowing towards nature-based solutions or PES markets to date? And what needs to be done to unlock the finance? So we've explored this issue recently in the publication that Alice mentioned in the intro on financing nature recovery in the UK. And as you can see, there's a range of challenges from uncertainty of revenues, so talking through those interventions and then the revenues associated with them. It can be that the revenues are uncertain because these are new areas, so it's unclear whether there will be a buyer or what that buyer may be willing to pay for certain ecosystem services or units. So uncertainty around the price and the volume as well. And there's a lot of interest in this area. And a lot of noise, if you will, in terms of interest in investing in nature-based solutions. And it's often talked about that there's a wall of money ready to invest, but there's a lack of projects which can adequately meet investors' requirements. We've certainly seen this in our experience working with partners, where some of the challenges are around the scale of projects that investors want to see, and also on delivery partners funding or ability to deliver over the time period that is needed, and a lack of data on the impact that can be achieved, or the data on what's required to show alignment with codes and standards. So a range of these challenges have all combined to, while there may be a lot of interest in this area, there aren't as many projects which have actually been financed to date. But now with identifying these challenges, we can address them, and there are a range of activities in play to do so. So I'll talk through then a bit about where the state of markets are, where, as I've just referred to, there have been challenges in terms of developing these markets or financing transactions, and that relates to partially the development of codes and methodologies. So that's a really key base point in terms of getting greater activity in this space. So as you can see, there's some that are sort of the technical proving stage. So this is where we think about salt marsh or seagrass. What are the rules around what that should look like? What is a unit that could be developed? We're working with a range of partners, for example, on developing a number of these codes and looking at then what the revenues could be, what that level looks like, and testing that out and wanting to ensure that there's a lot of rigor around the data and the methodologies that go into those, again, to create that market certainty. Then there's others which are much further along. So as you can see, and you'd likely be aware of, the peat and woodland codes, for example, are established and have had many stakeholders input into those. And also the existing climate regulation has provided impetus again for more activity in the carbon markets. And so this is where you can see that there's a journey, if you will, from starting to test these areas to then where actual capital investment can be raised. So what can we learn from then some of those more established markets, using carbon as a first area to dive into? So this visual is depicting how a carbon credit can be generated and then how that credit can be sold, providing a revenue stream. So as we talked about before, there's a project launch. There's the idea of collecting the data and following the methodology along the lines of the codes and guidance that exist and are deemed as credible in the market, to look at the amount of CO2 which could be sequestered and the amount of then units that could be generated. That project then needs to be audited with compliance with an existing code or standard, to then result in the issuance of those units, which then can be sold to carbon emitters or can be used by entities themselves in their own carbon emissions reductions efforts. And again, this is all underpinned by the use of codes and standards which provide that credibility in the market. So purchase credits then are retired by the end buyer, and if verified, the buyer can then claim offsets against its emission. This is an evolving area in terms of the view on offsets as well, with the Science-Based Target Initiative and further guidance coming out in terms of exactly how much should actually be within an entity's own supply chain and how much should be external. And so that is an evolving area and is an area where we will likely see further developments in the coming months in terms of a best-in-class way to address this. At this, as I referred to, the woodland and peatland codes are some of the most developed, related specifically to carbon, which provide guidance exactly on a methodology to follow in terms of developing units, which then can be sold into the market. Excuse me. So carbon revenues can provide a reliable long-term revenue stream from woodland or peatland. And with increasing demand from regulation and corporate net zero pledges, and carbon prices have been increasing, making this an even more attractive opportunity for investors and project developers alike. These revenues can then be considered alongside other revenues, so traditional revenues, to create projects which meet investor expectations in terms of the level of return they're seeking and also the terms of the return. It's important to note, though, that as there's a lot of interest in this area, that carbon projects must meet strict additionality criteria. So a project that what this means is that a project needs to only be able to be viable with the carbon credits. So if the project could go ahead already without carbon financing, then it's not considered additional. And so it's really important to think about this when thinking of stacking or with other revenue streams, for example, biodiversity, because this is a piece where there gets a lot of excitement generated, but actually when you go into the detail, it's important to look at what would then be feasible or not, and the trade-offs between going forward with, for example, woodland carbon code, and then also trying to achieve any sort of biodiversity unit on top of that. This is an issue I'll go into in subsequent slides, but it's also important in thinking about biodiversity credits and how we look at overall ecosystem services and the trade-offs between various units or codes which are being developed. So there's a number of lessons which we can derive from carbon markets, not just for biodiversity, but more broadly for payments for ecosystem services. Um, so a number of the key conditions which would be required, which have been set out in the codes and regulations related to carbon, are also applicable for biodiversity. So the idea that has to be real and measurable. So the impact achieved needs to be measurable, and this is where the metric and definitions are really important to define upfront, and that there's the data that can be collected to support that, both at the outset of project design, but also through project delivery and project maintenance to ensure that that data is actually providing the measurable progress that investors have paid for in terms of the generation of those units. And then we've talked a little bit about additionality. So thinking about how additionality, which is a concept that is now relatively well understood in the carbon world, what that means in terms of biodiversity, or how that is then applied, and what conditions there need to be to say this is truly additional, and isn't just resulting in, basically giving money where there would have been money spent already, and that activities are actually resulting in an overall improvement in biodiversity, and not just a status quo. Permanence is another really important one, where this is one that is, again, has a certain meaning in the carbon world, but where you look at certain new and emerging areas like soil carbon, what's the right level of permanence? And similarly with biodiversity, with existing regulations that have come out, we've seen varying and also voluntary standards. The years that are put forward as permanent can vary from 30 up to 99. And so this is, again, an evolving area where we do need to think about these issues and what makes the most sense in terms of each ecosystem service to ensure that it does allow activity to that allow these markets to develop in a way that's very credible and where impact can be achieved and maintained over time. And then, of course, the area of verification is extremely important. So the accredited independent party. So the idea that there needs to be standards and codes, as I said, but also those entities that are trusted to deliver the verification and provide that credibility to the market is very important. The cost of verification is also an important factor to consider, because obviously that process and cost can be prohibitive for smaller project developers or smaller scale actors. And so thinking about then how to address that issue to ensure that there's that verification and credibility, but that it can still be a market that smaller actors can participate in, is an area of ongoing attention. And then again, buyer governance. So the demand for credits. This is an area, biodiversity, for example, where we're seeing increasing demand for what does a voluntary unit of biodiversity mean, and what does that look like? So the task force on nature related disclosure is working on this issue to some degree. There's also activity in the voluntary markets on trying to certify nature positive, but this is definitely a nascent area where we're seeing demand for more credibility and codification in this area specifically. So I'll go into just a quick example that is one that Finance Earth has been working on together with our partners, RSPB and local partners in Sierra Leone, related to the carbon market. And this idea of bundling of ecosystem services. So this is a RED project, so reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, which is looking at how to attract repayable finance to support a project which delivers multiple outcomes. So avoided emissions, habitat improvement, species conservation, and the improvement of local livelihoods. And so we're currently working with a range of investors to identify what the type of payment could be for bundled outcomes or unbundled outcomes, and what that might look like in terms of existing codes or standards that could be used to then verify that those impacts are being achieved, and what then the price would be of those various pricing of those various outcomes and associated credits. So what I'm speaking about, in case, just to put a bit more detail behind that, there are existing carbon credit schemes. So verified carbon standard is one, the gold standard. There's many others that are either under development or exist internationally or in certain geographies. And while many of them historically, with the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol and others, we're first focused very much on carbon, so certifying the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or removals into a tradable carbon credit. There has been an evolution in now looking at trying to incorporate some of those other ecosystem services, so like biodiversity or livelihood indicators, where you're then seeing a carbon plus credit, which might be carbon plus biodiversity or carbon plus SDG alignment. But there's also activity looking at unbundling outcomes. So to basically sell various units to different buyers, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So there may be a social focused charity that's interested in looking at poverty reduction, for example, or women's access to employment. And another that may, or an insurance company that's specifically interested in natural flood management. And so, how do you then bring in those various buyers? And what does that look like in terms of the credits, as I said, and the price? And then looking at how you ensure that things are not being double counted, that you are achieving that aspect of additionality, and managing all of that. And so, this is definitely an evolving space that we are very focused on currently, and is one where you're likely to see quite a lot of emerging pilots and approaches to this, which will hopefully provide greater clarity to what this looks like for the market in the next year or so. Nutrients are another area that is an emerging area, so a regulated market where the polluter pays, so regulation stipulating that a polluter would need to purchase credits or units, which could either offset or directly reduce the impact of their activities. So nutrient credits could be generated, for example, through land use changes such as reduced chemical inputs on farm or the conversion of land use from a polluting activity to an activity which can, for example, reduce runoff of pollution into waterways. So these activities, while labeled as nutrients, so nutrient markets, actually have really important implications for achieving biodiversity objectives as well, as they'll often result in positive impacts for both habitat creation, species production, species revival. So this is again the point that it's important to look at ecosystem service markets holistically. And while they are often have been historically developed in a more siloed approach, to start to look at where there's actually multiple objectives and benefits can be achieved through different market interventions. So this is just an example of a nutrient example. So how this would work with attracting private capital, excuse me. The Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust so have raised 1 million, around 1 million, to acquire agricultural land for restoration in order to develop nutrient credits, which can then be sold to property developers to meet their regulatory obligations. So as you can see in the visual, the roles that I outlined previously, where there's the Wildlife Trust acting as a project developer, and managers of the project who are then engaging with corporates as the buyers of the credits, which is then those credits have been independently verified by Natural England, all of which provides then credibility to attract repayable finance. So then the ability to then take that package or program and go out to investors to say, we're providing you with the credibility, we're providing you with a regular income stream or revenue source, and this is how we will also deliver impact. So each of those pieces are really key to then make this mobilize private capital. And in this instance, so the land would be converted or restored for and maintained for at least 82 years. The offsets of the property development would offset around the development of around 400 homes and would have a net positive nitrate removal effect. Thinking about the fact that one house is predicted to cause about 3 kilograms of nitrates a year, and that the associated credits would be around 6,000 pounds for each certificate. So just to put a bit of detail behind what this looks like in practice, and again, happy to provide further detail as a follow-up to give you more insight into how this works. So if we move over to biodiversity then specifically, so a regulated market of biodiversity, so looking at UK BNG, there's obviously increasing, as I mentioned, increasing attention in both the voluntary and regulatory markets on biodiversity with interest to address this area. And England has passed regulation, which will soon come into force in November 2023, requiring biodiversity net gain. And many other countries like New Zealand and Colombia are adopting similar measures. So as we look at what the biodiversity net gain policy says, it's basically a requirement for all new developments to provide an overall habitat gain of at least 10% over time. So, and the value of this market in the UK is estimated at 100 to 250 million pounds per year by 2030. So just to give you an idea of the scale of this. So when we talk about markets developing, I think in the previous slide you would have seen that BNG was somewhat in the middle, but the idea is that this could be a quickly growing market, and that it could actually apply beyond just property developers, but also to other sectors. So what does this look like in practice? So on the right hand of your screen, I think, unless it's opposite, is a habitat banking business model. So what does this look like? So a property developer, similar to the nutrient case that I presented, would need to basically be offsetting their development. So they would need to purchase biodiversity credits in compliance with their planning requirements. So in order to get planning approval, they would then need to show, okay, this is where we're going to get and show a 10% biodiversity net gain over the life of the project. And with BNG, it's 30 years that needs to be maintained. Those credits can be delivered either on site, so a property developer themselves could deliver that biodiversity net gain on site, or they could be purchased from a partner. So, like in the previous example, an NGO who's producing biodiversity net gain units, or they could be purchased from a central bank. So, the Environment Bank, for example, is working in this area to basically create a habitat banking system where they can sell credits. This is also a very quickly evolving area. There's a lot of interest and activity already happening where we're working with a range of partners, whether that's from private developers who are looking at how to meet their in-house needs, as I said, or NGOs and wildlife trusts that also see an opportunity here to drive further finance into areas that they've been working on for a long time. And that there's still a bit of detail to be determined. We've seen a number of metrics already released from DEFRA, um, and some discussion around the idea of land banking versus habitat banking. I won't go into the detail today due to time, but that there's various ways to approach this, and it is still an evolving space where people start to work on what could work best in practice to ensure that the best outcome is achieved in terms of impact for biodiversity. So just to give you a quick example of that, we've worked together with RSPB on a habitat banking model. So looking at developing a way to use these types of payments to protect the cereal bunting. So a habitat specific to the species, a UK red data species, which had suffered huge decline in recent years, and looking at then how to acquire land which was important habitat for the cereal bunting, um, with the idea that the financing of that land acquisition could be repaid through mitigation payments. So the equivalent of now what's termed as BNG, with the idea that those payments can be used to pay back the investment, and that loan would be repaid over the course of 6 years through those mitigation payments. So I'll give you a bit more of what that looks like visually. So RSPB looking at creating a land acquisition vehicle, us working with them, advising on the structuring of that, working then with the property developers who would need to pay the local council. So for planning permission, they would need to be buying biodiversity net gain units. And so the land acquisition vehicle, acquiring the habitat site together, working with local farmers and landowners to then restore and manage that habitat to deliver those biodiversity net gain units, and all of that being taken to raise commercial investment, in this case through Lloyd's Bank, in order to bring in the financing needed to execute this project. So this is just a practical example that has already happened. So this isn't just a theoretical. This is already happening on the ground, and it will be happening more and more, especially with the as regulatory clarity is delivered with BNG, and that importance of regulation in building these markets and giving that certainty to the various actors involved. So that's been a bit of a whirlwind tour. I did want to leave enough time for questions and discussion. Just to summarize some of the areas that we've pointed out. So the idea to give you some ideas and approaches that have worked in terms of innovative financing options, looking at various markets, what lessons can we learn? There are considerable challenges still in mobilizing the scale of finance needed in this space, but also a lot of learning which has already been achieved, which we can build on in terms of driving investment in this space. So some of the key areas that are important to consider are around, as I just said, developing the regulated or compliant regulation and compliance schemes in order to achieve the scale and impact that we need to in this area. So a lot of activity, and there's often a lot of attention focused on the voluntary markets, particularly, voluntary carbon market has grown significantly in the last few years, but really regulation is required in order to achieve the scale at pace that we need to provide that clarity. Voluntary market, again, also because there's a lack of, it's often unclear about which standards are best quality, are the credits being issued of high integrity, and that's where regulation can really come in to say, this is what high integrity means, and this is what we require of various sectors in different ways. It's also really important to involve all stakeholders. So, communities are the ones involved on the ground and are impacted by ecosystem services. So where you have an improvement in biodiversity or a reduction in biodiversity, or where there's flood management, it's really the communities that are directly impacted and need to be involved in all decision making around what the metrics look like, how they're deployed and implemented, but also that investors are thinking about communities as the beneficiaries of these projects. So that's where we're focused, as we saw a lot of activity in the carbon space in particular, where the benefits of carbon were all going to big corporates or externally. And we wanted to really ensure that we could work with partners to ensure that those benefits stayed within communities and that they were the direct beneficiaries of these markets developing. And I've said it a few times, but the credibility of the metrics is really important, and the data behind measuring against those metrics is extremely important in order to maintain that credibility and activity in these markets. So data is still a huge challenge. Even how to measure, what to measure. Biodiversity is a particularly challenging area in terms of data, because there are such a range of species and habitats, and is there to have trying to find one way to approach that is nearly impossible. So getting together the methodology and approach for each species, each habitat is time consuming, and hopefully is being assisted by the advent of technology and others, but it is still an area where there is a huge lift to be done to make sure that all the data that we need is available. And then, as I said, establishing those independent verification and registry systems. So I've said it in the presentation already, the Wild West that exists in these markets is an area where there has been a lack of transparency at many times, and there have been then retrospective studies looking at the impact achieved, which have, especially in the carbon space, have shown that in areas where we would have thought that certain impact had achieved, it hadn't been. And so there does need to be more transparency built in at the outset into these markets, especially as regulation comes in and can create more of that transparency and registry system. So Article 6, which finally last year as part of the Paris Agreement and COP26 came to some agreement in terms of a global registry around carbon, but there does still need to be further work done. And the COP later this year on biodiversity hopefully will also move further along that path. But then finally, it's really important to think about the trade-offs and synergies that I've talked about with ecosystem services to ensure that we're not just pursuing one objective at the expense of others, and to think about those trade-offs and synergies from both an environmental and social perspective, so that we ensure that we're achieving win-wins as much as we can, rather than biodiversity being pursued at the expense of carbon, or vice versa. So with that, I will sum up and would welcome questions. And also, as I said, if we run out of time to answer all of the questions, we'd be happy for you to approach us individually after the session. So thank you again.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was a fantastic overview of clearly a very complex and technical area, but it's one that we absolutely need to engage with so that we're able to unlock the additional funding that we need to support nature recovery and to up its scale and pace. I mean, not just in Wales, but across the UK and the rest of the world. So thank you for that. The slides, I think, will be available to share on the Hoover website, so people can go back and have a look through them. We've got questions in the chat, so I'll just pick a few out for you. But for those online, please feel free to pop any more questions in, and any that we don't get to now, we will collate. So there's one from Alison Heal. How do we make sure that these financial mechanisms lead to nature positive outcomes rather than just enabling mitigation and compensation for destruction of actually irreplaceable woodland, salt marsh, dunes, grasslands, etc.?
Yeah, this is a really important point. And I think really comes down to the codes and the methodologies that need to be followed at the outset, so that this shouldn't just be offsetting, or moving impact from one area to another, but that actually the global impact is an improvement in ecosystem services, and that really comes down to ensuring that the codes, standards, regulation that are developed are done so in a way which makes sure that that can't happen. So putting in enough rules around the system to ensure that it's not just a box checking exercise, or that we're not resulting in leakage, so activity just being moved to another area or another geography, that we are able to achieve overall positive impact. But I share that concern, which is why we're very active in working on the codes, to make sure that they are credible and actually achieving impact.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So moving on to the next question. This is from Dan Ward. So essentially, it's about what the role of the state, so here in Wales, to be Welsh Government, is in terms of developing and delivering PES markets.
So the role of the state is really providing that regulation. So to say that it isn't just up to companies or actors to do this on a voluntary basis, but to say it is required, and to then set up that system. So that requirement then needs to include a target. It needs to include the methodology for how to achieve that target. So what can the project developers do to meet a standard of credibility? But then also, what are the penalties for non-compliance? So obviously, regulation that doesn't have teeth is difficult to then enforce and monitor and actually get impact achieved. So the role of the state in providing that regulation and that the compliance system is extremely important.
Thanks. So moving on now is a question from Joshua Gittins, and this is coming from the sort of nutrient markets angle. So he says that what's challenging is offsetting the local effects on biodiversity or water quality by implementing mitigation elsewhere in a catchment. Any thoughts on how to tackle this spatial issue of local impacts from development versus the wider balancing in of the books? So how do we incentivize regulators to push for net gain in this particular market?
Yeah, I think this is an important issue as well that we've seen also in the biodiversity net gain space. So I think, the way that it's been approached there is to say it's not just one habitat can be interchanged with another. The distinctiveness of the habitat matters, just like, as you're saying, the catchment matters. So to put in more detail around that, to say, for nutrients, for example, it can't just be that you're buying credits from another catchment or an area, that isn't related, but that you're actually reducing the overall nitrates or pollution in this catchment area, which is important. So if there's more development going ahead, it needs to be as a result of reduction somewhere else, but specifically in that catchment. And this is really the importance. These markets would, I mean, in the past, there with carbon specifically, and carbon being, more fungible across borders, but biodiversity and nutrients being very local, really need to have the rules around them set that the intervention then needs to be local as well.
Thank you. Just to say to anybody online that actually wants to put their hand up and ask a question, feel free to, but we'll keep an eye on the chat for questions. So there is there's another question from Neil Lambert, who's reflecting on a session yesterday with CIEEM, which looked at some of these approaches, including biodiversity net gain. He sort of mentioned there's quite a lot of negativity towards elements such as an arbitrary target, the metrics, and so on. And he's asking for your thoughts on the best bits that could be taken from biodiversity net gain in England and what to avoid. So we don't have, biodiversity net gain in the same way in Wales. So yeah, what can we shamelessly steal and what parts do we want to avoid?
Yes, I mean, and I think that is part of the luck of England going first in this respect, is that you have the opportunity to take some of the early learnings. And again, they still are early learnings. And I wouldn't want to say yet what I think is the best or what is the worst, but there are, I think, positives in terms of the detail of the metric. And as I said, the idea of looking at the distinctiveness of the habitat as a key requirement. So not allowing just one habitat interchanged for another, I think is an important element to maintain. I do think an area that will be important to look at that maybe is a weakness of the DEFRA one is around permanence, and looking at what that and maintenance. So what that means over time, and whether that 30 years is the right time scale or what needs to be adjusted, I think is an important one. But happy to pick that up with you, Neil, offline and go into more detail as well.
Thanks. We'll move on to a question after this is from Sarah Ailing. What's the best approach to developing codes, single benefits like carbon or nutrients, or by habitat with associated multiple benefits? And what are the pros and cons of the different approaches?
Yes, and this is a really good question, a somewhat complicated one. So I think you can say that there's value in an international standard, for example. So to get international agreement, whether that's at UN level or whatnot, because many players, so that those that would be buying the credits are global, and so it would increase activity if you were able to get international agreement. On the other hand, as discussed, many of the particulars are very local. And so what makes sense for a woodland carbon code or a peatland carbon code in the UK may not make a lot of sense in the tropics, for example. So, it's not that Indonesia can now adopt the UK's peatland code and say, great, we have a peatland code. And also, as you've raised, so habitat, when we look at specific ecosystem services or codes like carbon or habitat, there is, I think, pros and cons of both, because as I said, you have more tradability, or you can look at then with a service like water, perhaps across borders more easily, whereas habitat, you then need to have a more localized market where it would be smaller. And so then there are challenges around the price that then is those units are trading for. So there are trade-offs in terms of scale of the market versus impact on the ground, and taking into some of those local considerations.
Thank you. I'm going to take the privilege of asking a question now. So as you'll be aware, earlier this week, the Minister for Climate Change launched the recommendations arising from the biodiversity deep dive that she's held over the last a few months with a core group of experts and practitioners. They came up with a series of recommendations, one of which was around unlocking finance for nature recovery. And it was an underlying theme in pretty much every meeting that we had as part of the deep dive, whether it was the core group, the expert groups, the stakeholder roundtables. And there are some specific recommendations there. So for Welsh Government to have a clear policy position, particularly around the private investment, including identifying what interventions may be needed, and then some separate sort of work looking specifically at the marine environment. You mentioned earlier that one of the benefits of and this is my paraphrasing, being slightly behind the curve on this compared to others, is that you have the benefit of being able to look at what works and what hasn't, and sort of adapt those bits to what we want in Wales. And one of your slides was around what the barriers to financing nature are, all of which are completely sort of applicable to the Wales context. So the project pipeline or lack of project pipeline, costs, capacity, science and standards, and so on. Which I know all of those will need to be tackled to get to where we want to be in terms of unlocking private investment. But in terms of sequencing them, what would you say is the key area to start with, and then sort of work out from?
That's a good question. And yes, it is. Prioritization is necessary because obviously there is a lot to be done. I think it's really important to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good and to start to get some definitions down. So taking from the learning, but not getting hampered by needing to come up with a perfect code. As I said, we've seen the DEFRA adapted multiple times since it was first released, and understanding that that's going to be part of trialing things and seeing how things work when they are played out. There's only so much that you can foresee, and you don't want to either get too bogged down in making a perfect code or standard so that it doesn't come out for years and activity is held up. At the same time, you do want to create a bit of market certainty. So you want to be able to say, this is how often we would be updating it and what we will grandfather in or not. So because otherwise you will also hamper activity in that regard. So you do need to find the right balance between getting some code and guidance out there, but and wanting to make sure that it's credible enough and robust enough to protect local interests and safeguard and make sure that you're going to get robust impact, but also understand that it won't be perfect in its first instance. You will need to continue to improve, and that building in a way to do that is predictable will be really important for the market development.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got probably just time for one more question in the last couple of minutes. So back to Alison. So she says, what did she say? You said that we don't want to risk investment in biodiversity gain at the cost of losing investment in carbon, or words to that effect. Isn't the risk the other way round? Investment in carbon doesn't always result in good biodiversity outcomes, but I can't think of any biodiversity gains which wouldn't bring carbon benefits. So is this really a risk or rather a reason for focusing investment in biodiversity?
I mean, it's a good point. So often it is. I mean, and the examples are more towards the latter example that Alison has raised. So looking at where carbon has resulted in monoculture species being pursued or whatnot that don't have as many biodiversity benefits in terms of tree species or animals, et cetera, that can exist in those environments. Where I would say is looking at the trade-offs between the habitats. So where are you going to get the most in terms of also looking at investment in this area? Where can you look at so it might be a patch of land which has, in terms of habitat type and size, et cetera, makes the most sense in terms of biodiversity improvements. So focusing there and then doing the investment in areas where you wouldn't have then a carbon benefit. So I'm thinking of things like you may have minimal carbon benefits. So for example, in grasslands or other areas where you might have considerable biodiversity improvements, but not as much in carbon, and wanting to make sure that you look at that and look at the trade-offs for the multiple objectives that you're trying to reach.
Brilliant, thank you, Elizabeth. So we've got a minute to go, so we will wrap up there. We've captured all of the comments and questions in the chat. So thank you to everybody online for joining the workshop this afternoon and for all of your input. As has already been mentioned, there is obviously a growing interest in this area. As you're aware from the conversations we've had on the particular piece of the contract, that there is nervousness in Wales around some of the private investment and some of the unintended consequences that could come as a result of that. And obviously, those need to be carefully managed. But I think, we won't be able to achieve our ambitions without securing additional investment. We just need to make sure that it's done in a way that it's beneficial to Wales, and it, you know, it involves and takes local communities with them, as opposed to kind of that perception of it being done to them, because we know historically that doesn't land well, and you know, we can see it in the news at the moment with some of the stories about buying up land for tree planting and so on. So it is, you know, a complex area, one that we absolutely need to engage with, because it's going to support the delivery of our collective ambitions for nature recovery.
Definitely, definitely. Very important to consider. And thank you again for the opportunity to discuss with you all today.
Brilliant. Thank you again, Elizabeth. Thank you for a really thought-provoking workshop. And yes, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Great. Thanks, and
Thanks
good
all.
afternoon to all. Take care.
Bye. Okay, so we will very shortly be going into our final session of this afternoon. This is a message from Sir David Henshaw to close off the conference. Sir David Henshaw, as I'm sure you're aware, is the Chair of Natural Resources Wales. He's led the Green Recovery Group, providing advice to Welsh Government following COVID of actions and recommendations that could be taken to support a green recovery. We have a recorded message from Sir David, and I'm going to hopefully hand over to one of the team behind the scenes who'll be able to play the message.
Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to close this year's Wales Biodiversity Conference. It's obvious we're facing a nature and climate crisis. We see an unprecedented decline in our biodiversity due to human activity and climate change. We know that without a healthy and valued natural environment, we suffer. When we threaten the environment, we're threatening our food supply, our health, our jobs, our economy, and our sense of place, which is why restoring nature for nature's sake is in everybody's interests. I often reflect that when we talk about environment and climate emergencies, that biodiversity sometimes sits at the back of the stage. I hope that this week's conference has given us some way forward in trying to move that agenda to the front of the stage. The Programme for Government commits Welsh Government to embed our response to the climate and nature emergency in everything we do. So we need to act now and deliver a decade of action if we're to become nature positive. For a small country, we punch well above our weight, but there's always more we can learn from each other. That's what's been most valuable from this conference. I've dipped in various sessions during the week and been fascinated at some of the insights and reflections that will help us in some of that journey. We started with the biodiversity deep dive, where Julie James and others from the task force led us through the key themes and recommendations that will be in place to ensure meaningful delivery of the target to protect and effectively manage at least 30% of our land, freshwater and sea for nature by 2030, known as the 30-30 target. I won't rehearse the recommendations. They're ambitious and far-reaching, and they clearly set out our aims for this decade of action. But it's not just about simply expanding protected boundaries on paper maps. We must build the health and resilience of these areas to support the full range of nature that depends on them, and in a changing climate, improve the connectivity between them to enable species to move, for example. But realising these ambitions to meet 30-30 targets and halt biodiversity loss will only be possible with a Team Wales approach, collective action across the length and breadth of Wales. And the time's right. The public demand for environmental action is the highest we've ever seen it, particularly amongst young people. And we saw public support for nature growing during the pandemic, as the importance of connecting with nature has become even more apparent in our everyday lives. So we need to capitalise on this and harness this environmental awareness into true nature behaviour change. It's clear there are major policy decisions to be taken at a governmental level. There are actions by organisations, public and private, to change the agenda. But most important often is the small actions by millions of us to actually do the things that make a big difference on the ground. A million small improvements makes the big change. For a nature rich in Wales, we need to think big, scaling up our efforts to keep carbon locked in peat deposits, restoring and improving habitats, for our native species and working to increase the population of some of our most threatened species. Running parallel with this conference is the IUCN conference, with its particular focus on peatland this year. We've made great strides in increasing the extent of peatland that we've restored, and today we launch another landscape scale project, the Lifequake Bog project down in Crimlin near Swansea. But as I said, policy and legislation is crucial in helping in our quest for nature positive. The new sustainable farming scheme will see farmers actively managing at least 10% of their land to maintain and enhance habitats, and will be complemented with a suite of actions to manage soils, woodlands, livestock health and business performance. Farmers and land managers are integral to achieving our nature recovery aims. I think we all recognise the deep connection farmers have with their land, often stretching back generations, but we need to change the way in which we use our land, and we must take the farming community with us in that journey. And it is a journey where we need to enable sustainable farm food production to assist alongside action to protect and enhance nature. I was particularly fascinated by the presentation on the National Nature Service, which was one of those projects that came out through the Green Recovery Group, which I chaired during the pandemic. It's an opportunity to create new jobs and livelihood opportunities in sustainably managing and using natural resources and embedding green skills across the workforce. I look forward to seeing the initiative in action as the demonstrator project in the Valleys Regional Park develops. As I've said, we need to deploy more nature-based solutions in every part of our lives that will help us adapt and mitigate against climate change. But we need to do this together. One of my learnings in my role as chair of NRW is that you can't sort these problems out using a silo approach. Everything's connected. So we need to work together, be in the tent as one team, working together and working on the solutions that we know by acting collectively, we can make a big difference. We need to build a broad coalition to reassemble and reinvigorate the nuts, bolts and cogs of the species and habitats we all depend on, and capitalise on the renewed sense of place and connection we have with our environment as we work to put Wales on a solid footing on the path to nature's recovery. Together we know about the land we live in, its contours, its watercourses, its shorelines and coastal waters. But we need the collective expertise, creativity and passion that we have to deliver the real outcomes for biodiversity and ecosystems for present and future generations in Wales. Our generation needs to be known by our successors as the responsible generation, as the responsible predecessors who took action to make change in this very crucial part of the Earth's agenda. But it's been a tremendous week, and we've had some big announcements. Now Wales is going to achieve by 2030 some really big steps and some excellent presentations on significant pieces of work from across Wales and the launch of a new landscape scale project. I hope the conference will continue to stimulate this decade of decisive action and we can show the leadership needed as we enter the COP15 talks in Montreal in a month's time. Thank you indeed for all your contributions during the week. I look forward to seeing the action following as we go forward. Thank you very much.
So that's the end of this week's Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference for 2022 with the theme, the Global Biodiversity Emergency and the Actions and Solutions from Wales. I hope you found the sessions interesting and thought-provoking. We started off, as Sir David mentioned, with the launch of the Biodiversity Deep Dive recommendations, and they're intended to be the route map to 30 by 30 plus wider nature recovery. And then we've had a number of sessions on different days covering a wide range of areas from urban communities, wildfires and the sustainable farming scheme. As I mentioned earlier, if you've missed any of the sessions, they're all recorded and will be available on the Hoover website along with any slides that we used. Feedback forms will be circulated in the next couple of weeks, and we'd very much appreciate your views on the sessions that you've attended, the conference as a whole, and particularly how it works as an online event. I'd like to offer huge thanks to everybody that's been involved in organising the conference, to all of the speakers for the time that you gave up for your individual sessions and for all the work that went into the presentations and the workshops that you delivered. To all of the facilitators who hosted the different sections and ensured the smooth running of them. And, and most of all, thank you to the Wales Biodiversity Partnership team and all of those who helped behind the scenes to make this conference such a success. Running a conference over a week, filling all of the agenda slots is no mean feat at all. So a huge congratulations to everybody that's been involved in the successful running of this conference. I am sure there'll be a couple, particularly in the Wales Biodiversity Partnership, who will be having a well-earned glass of wine or beer this evening, and you can very much pat yourselves on the back for a job well done. So in drawing the conference to a close, I'd like to thank you all for your input too. So that's attending the sessions, all the comments and questions in the chat. I think, that particularly sort of seeing the comments and questions sees, the level of interest in the different sessions that there are and all of, all of the sort of areas that we still need to explore. As Sir David mentioned, the time for action on nature recovery has never been more urgent. So I hope the sessions that you've dialed into have been stimulating, that they've given you knowledge and they've motivated you and possibly provided some connections to step up the action that's needed for Wales to become nature positive over the next decade. So diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for joining everybody, and enjoy your weekend when it comes. Take care. Bye.